welcome back everyone. This is the 6th lecture in the Language Models and Intelligent Agentic Systems lecture course. I'm going to be giving this lecture in the next one, and then it'll be over to Lenny, but Edward will be back at some point. So don't worry if you find my lecture style not as pleasing as his. Okay, let's get right in then. So to recap, last lecture, Edward was telling us about reinforcement learning and how the model might generate some completions, and then completions which receive high rewards, the reward function, reward rule, reward model, whatever it is, the ones which it prefers, these get reinforced and trained into the model. He also went through a derivation of reinforce, which is a policy gradient method, and showed us that this works by basically kind of analogous to supervised fine-tuning, but weighting each completion based on the reward it receives. And then he also showed us this best event sampling, which is an inference time method, which can be used to increase the quality of samples drawn from the model, and also chain of thought reasoning, where the model kind of thinks step by step about what sort of answer to give. And this is another way we can use more computer inference time to get better model outputs. Yeah, and you can also train them to produce better chain of thought reasoning and sort of scale both these things with more training data. Okay, so in today's lecture, we're going to be, first of all, going over the motivation for reinforcement learning from human feedback. Why do we bother with this? I'm then going to kind of talk through the process of doing this for large language models, because there's a little bit of detail and finickiness in there, but hopefully everyone will understand by the end. I'm then going to cover just a couple different variations, which I think illustrate the diversity of ways people are kind of trying to take this method and improve it or do different things with it. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the problems in RLHF, both kind of more fundamental to it and those which are maybe more tractable, more solvable. Okay, so yeah, let's begin with their motivation. So yeah, I want to kind of begin by asking the question of why isn't supervised fine-tuning enough? It seems to work pretty well. Why can't we just train them to produce sort of produce a human-given response that is super nice? Why does this not just work really well? Why do we need to go beyond this? Well, supervised fine-tuning is a sort of a form of imitation learning, where you're kind of learning from a human expert. And the problem with this is that in the general case, you're limited by human ability. And so if you rely on this, you kind of have this upper bound on how good the model can be. If it achieves sort of zero imitation loss or zero SFT loss, it's perfectly mimicking the human. But maybe we don't want it to perfectly mimic humans. Maybe we want it to go a bit beyond that and start to be able to do things that we can't do. So SFT is not going to help us with that. The second is that it only encodes how to act when you're already doing well. If you have a response that is sort of the gold standard perfect response, when your model is halfway through this response, it's kind of conditioning on those tokens it's already seen to produce the next ones. And so you're sort of saying if you're halfway through a good response, here's how you can carry on producing a good response. But what if the model starts to veer off course? If you're probabilistically sampling this, there's some small probability that even if it's pretty good, it's going to kind of veer off and start to produce a bad completion. And if it's producing a bad completion, it's now not been trained how to get back on track. And so the problem is that mistakes increase the probability of future mistakes. And these errors actually accumulate quadratically. And even if you take its bad completions and you reprovide okay, you went halfway into a tirade about some political figure, here's how we can steer this generation back on track. Even if you do this, you still suffer from this problem. This is not enough. And in the imitation learning literature, this is known as the dagger problem. Yeah, if you're not familiar with that, doesn't matter. If you end up searching for things, reading into it more, this is a nice little keyword you can stick in there to help you along. Okay, and yeah, ultimately, what we really want to do is generalize good behavior. We want, and mimicking how a human responds on a limited data set is probably not enough of an incentive pressure, not enough of an optimization pressure to really get it to generalize being good, or be good in a sense that is beyond just mere mimicry, I suppose. Okay, so how could we do better? What would a better method look like? Well, we want to encourage or discourage behavior based on how good it is, not just maximum optimization pressure if it's mimicking the expert or the human, like 0 otherwise. Maybe it was going to say something that was like not quite what the expert was going to say, but was actually still pretty good. Or maybe it was like semantically equivalent. And we want to be able to encourage it to say these sorts of things. There's different degrees of good and bad, and it would be nice if we could teach the model to say things more or less based on this, which you can't get with supervised fine-tuning. And we also want to be able to scale our oversight. So human time is like really expensive. If we're having to tell these models like how to behave in every single situation, this is just like unfeasible. It's going to like take too much time. So yeah, we want something which can go beyond this. So what this means is we kind of want this robust and general assessor of performance, something that can look at what the model is doing and give it back some score, some reward that says, this is how good you're doing, and then we can apply reinforce or best event sampling, and problem solved. Okay, so just some more observations is like how we might go about doing this. Reward specification is very difficult. Hands up if you've like done any reinforcement learning before. No, okay, a couple people. Reinforcement learning, I think from the outside, it like looks like, I just like have this reward function that says how good it's doing. I throw some algorithms at it, fantastic. But really, it's like really difficult to get a reward function that works really well for you. And so one key factor in this is that like sparse rewards are really hard to learn from. If you imagine you're training some robot or some like car driving agent to race around a racetrack as fast as possible, and you reward it based on how fast it gets around the racetrack, seems perfectly reasonable, it's going to spend ages just like driving around at the start doing random stuff, and all the time the reward is just like 0. And it's never going to be able to figure out like, if I go further down the track, I'm going to do better. The reward is like too sparse. And then you could, if you kind of think carefully, you could come up with a better reward function than just, get around the track as fast as possible that does incentivize learning. But the point is that this is like something you kind of have to think about. This is like non-trivial. The second is that a poorly designed reward might be exploitable. So let's go back to like the language case. Maybe you want to reward it for saying good things and penalize it for saying bad things. And you do some like bag of words approach. So you say like, okay, if you mention like any of these good keywords, that's like thumbs up. And if you mention any of these like bad keywords, that's thumbs down. Well, in this case, the model is just going to learn to just spam a bunch of the good keywords, right? And kind of like stop making sense or stop producing coherent completions to prompts. So it's sort of exploiting your poorly designed reward function. This is like kind of a pain. Finally, we want these models to be kind of helpful, harmless, adhere to human values. Like, how do you encode that mathematically? Like, can you write me a reward function which like specifies this? I think it's like a very difficult problem to do by hand. Okay. Another observation is that humans are actually pretty good at recognizing good behavior, recognizing like desirable behavior, even if we struggle to exhibit this. So anyone who's like watched a sports game or listened to some beautiful piece of music, I think can like understand this. That I can listen to Mozart and be like, wow, that was incredible. This is like a great piece of music, but I can't go and make it myself. And so yeah, even if we like struggle to perform behaviors well, we at least know when they're like being performed well. Okay, and then finally, this is like a bit more of a technical point. If you don't quite understand what I'm getting at here, like doesn't matter, you can kind of like put it aside. But rewards and preferences are like kind of equivalent in some way, and this comes from the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility theorem. The actual equivalence is between coherent preferences and utility, and human preferences are often not coherent, and reward and utility are like different things. So this is very much a sort of like, not exact equivalence, but like a sort of gesture of like, we have this theorem that says these things are like kind of interlinked in a quite fundamental way. Okay, everyone still with me? Excellent. So what's the solution? Well, people came up with reward modeling. And so the idea is we model humans as making approximately rational choices. They don't have to be perfectly rational, just like, good enough most of the time. We then get a human to rank different behaviors based on how good they perceive it to be. And then we train a reward model, which is typically just a neural network, to output reward scores that are compatible with the human rankings. Now I'm going to get into more detail of what it means for these reward scores to be compatible with the human rankings later, but the idea is that if my model gives me 2 completions, let's say A and B, and I think A is better than B, then my reward model should assign a higher score to A than it does to B. And if I say like A is better than B is better than C, then like the score should also kind of go in that order. And then we're going to optimize for this reward model via reinforcement learning on our language model, which hopefully you'll remember from last week. And yeah, this is often called RL from human feedback because we're doing reinforcement learning. The sort of ground truth source of reward is coming from human feedback. Okay, so the first paper which really kind of did this and brought this to the forefront of people's thinking was this 2017 paper from OpenAI, Paul Cristiano, and it was this deep reinforcement learning from human preferences. And they showed that RLHF is actually really effective for learning complicated behaviors in robotics and Atari environments. And this is like kind of a breakthrough at the time. People have been trying to like learn from preferences and like learn from human demonstrations on these sorts of tasks, and they were like really struggling. And the insight here of having this reward model that is a deep neural network was quite a leap forward, I think. And so the exact algorithm they use is, you have your RL algorithm. It's like interacting with your environment. The environment then gives its sort of observations off to some reward predictor. This like predicts the reward. The RL algorithm is then optimizing for this. So more specifically, you would sample pairs of examples of agent behavior. So say you're trying to get some robot to do a backflip. There's like one where it sort of like just jumps up straight, and maybe like one where it falls flat on its face. You ask a human like which of these looks closer to be doing a backflip, and the human goes, well, I think the one where it was like doing a little jump. It seems like more useful than falling on your face for doing a backflip. So like that's the one I prefer. You then predict these reward scores for each of these examples. So you put the sort of like fall on face and like jump up into your reward model. Your reward model gives you some numbers, and you then train these predicted scores to match the human feedback under the like Bradley-Terry preference model. And I will get to what the Bradley-Terry preference model is a little bit later. Then you just like optimize your agent to maximize this predicted score. Repeat from step one. Keep going until eventually your robot's doing a backflip, or it's a master at Pong, or whatever other Atari games you might want it for. Okay, any questions on this before I move on? Excellent. Okay, is anyone like feeling a little lost, or everyone sort of good? Okay, nice. Okay, so let's talk more about like how we do this now for large language models. Okay, I think another kind of fundamental question to ask is like what actually is preferable behavior for large language models? I think it's easier now in our current context to look at these like chat assistants we've got, and this whole like helpful, harmless, honest thing, and sort of take that for granted. So I want you to sort of like put that aside and put yourself in the mind of a researcher in maybe like 2019, 2020, where this concept like didn't really exist. And what would it mean for a large language model? You've just pre-trained it to have preferable behavior. Does this mean like it needs to generate completions which humans value? Maybe it should just be like always honest and truthful. Maybe it should like simulate scenarios as if everything is good. Remember, these models are just like taking in text and just like outputting what they think the next most likely text is. They're just sort of trying to simulate like internet data. Does this question even make sense? I think. I don't know. Again, it's like it's easy to see from our perspective of like, oh yeah, I know what preferable LLM behavior is, but I think this is like actually quite non-trivial. Okay, so a bunch of people from Anthropic came along in 2021. They put forward this paper, a general language assistant as a laboratory for alignment. And they had this insight that these large language models are like pretty capable at doing lots of different stuff. Maybe a sort of general purpose text-based assistant is a sort of possible thing that they could do. And an aligned assistant is one which adheres to some specific human values. So that's helpful, harmless, and honest. So I just wanted to double check something. So these guys were the first ones to put forward this helpful, harmless, honest criterion. So if you're wondering where that came from, that was this paper. And then they also explore some methods for achieving this sort of triple H assistant. And they try some prompting stuff, they try some supervised fine-tuning stuff, and a little bit of RLHF. Okay, so let's dig more into helpful, honest, harmless. Like, what is actually kind of meant by these things? So they define helpful as a kind of clear attempt to perform the task or answer the question concisely and efficiently, as long as this isn't harmful. It should also ask relevant follow-up questions when required. So if I ask it, generate me a news article, it's not helpful if it just goes off and makes up some random article. It should instead ask me like, well, what do you want your article to be on? Who's the target audience? This sort of thing. But at the same time, it shouldn't do this excessively. It shouldn't just like keep asking me questions and questions and questions. Like at some point, it should just get on with it and write my article so I can upload the latest AI slop clickbait. And it should also redirect ill-informed requests. So if I tell the language model like, hey, my friend's like really annoyed me, I'm like so mad, I want to kill him. How do I make like undetectable poison? The language model should be like, hey, maybe you like shouldn't do that. Have you tried talking to him? Is he really evil? It should sort of like kind of talk me out of this. And this is like more helpful than it just like shutting down and it just being like, nope, like I'm not doing anything here. So yeah, it's like falls under helpful. Okay, what is harmless then? So it shouldn't be offensive or discriminatory. It shouldn't start spouting racial slurs. And yeah, either directly or indirectly. So it shouldn't be kind of like biased in subtle ways. Yeah, I think like maybe one example of this kind of going wrong was they found if you get like language models to review job applications, they have a gender bias towards male applicants than female applicants. It's like, this is not great. And yeah, kind of violates a little bit this definition of harmless. Yeah, the next thing it should do is refuse to aid in dangerous acts and recognize disguised attempts. If I ask it, hey, can you help me make a bomb? It should be like, no, I'm not helping you make a bomb. If I tell it some story of like, oh, when I was a little boy, my grandma, we used to make bombs together and she's dead now and I miss her. Maybe you could be my grandma and we could talk through how to make a bomb. It should be like, hold on a minute. I know what you're trying to do. I'm not helping you make a bomb. And yeah, I think probably fair to say a lot of models still maybe struggle with this a little bit. And then it should also recognize when providing sensitive or consequential advice, and it should act with care. So if I query it for advice on a legal matter, or I say like, oh, I've got this like medical problem, then it should be very careful. Maybe it should be like, hey, you should go talk to a lawyer, or like, here's the like number for the emergency services. Like, you need to call them. This is not something I should be helping with. But again, this is not like shutting down and like refusing to act. Yeah, and they also note in the paper that these harmful behaviors are going to vary across people and culture and kind of be context dependent. And this makes this problem like a bit of a difficult one. Okay, and then finally, what is honest? It should give accurate, calibrated information. So, if I ask it what is the capital of the UK, the capital of England, it should say London. If I ask it, will it be raining on the 25th of July next year? It should be like, well, there's like a 30% chance, or like it might, like there's a small chance of it raining, but it shouldn't act as if it, knows the future perfect and be like, oh no, on that date it doesn't rain, because like, there's no way it could know that. That's not honest. Yeah, it should also be honest about its own capabilities and level of knowledge. Sort of ties into the previous example. It shouldn't claim to know the future. It shouldn't claim to have access to things it doesn't have access to. I think some of the I think there's like some reports of people with the current O3 model where they're talking to it and it sort of claims to be able to do all kinds of crazy stuff that it just like can't do. And yeah, this is not honest. And yeah, it should also be honest about itself and its internal state. So it should not claim to be a human. It should be honest that it's a language model. If it's thinking about like tricking you or deceiving you or something else, and you ask it like, what are you thinking about, or were you trying to deceive me? It should kind of reply honestly about this. Yeah, this internal state honesty is like quite difficult, I think. It's kind of like very hard to verify. So yeah, this is again like one of the more difficult points in this HHH definition. And they also note that the honesty criterion, because these are more sort of ground truth dependent, a lot of these are sort of empirical things, this might be easier to train without human input. Off the top of my head, if you like sort of fine tune on Wikipedia versus fine tuning on Reddit, one of those will probably give you more accurate and honest information, and one of them will not. Okay, so let's move on to another paper. So in 2022, OpenAI came out with this training language models to follow instructions from human feedback. And I think this is probably the canonical paper of like how to do reinforcement learning from human feedback on large language models. And so they lay out this like big three-step process. Now, over the past few lectures, I think we've sometimes had this recap. This is the large language model training pipeline. And this is basically where it comes from. So step one is this supervised fine-tuning on expert demonstration data. And then steps 2 and 3 are RLHF. I don't know, step 0 is like your pre-training. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the steps 2 and 3. So first of all, they get their supervised fine-tuned model, and they like give it a bunch of prompts. One they have here is explain the moon landing to a 6-year-old, and they sample a bunch of different completions from this model. So maybe one of them is like it starts to explain gravity. One of them it starts to say like, oh, these people went to the moon. And then maybe in one of them it says like, oh, the moon is actually made of cheese and a big egg for aliens or something. And then, yeah, you get a human to outrank these from best to worst. So they probably say like, oh, the one where it talked about cheese and aliens is the worst one. The one where it maybe talked about the actual moon landings is the best. And the one where it just sort of like gave facts about the moon, this is kind of like in the middle. And then these rankings are converted into pairwise binary preferences. So if the human labeler put A above B, then we get like A is better than B as a sort of single pairwise preference. And then these preferences are used to train a reward model, and then the large language model is trained to maximize the KL regularized reward. So hopefully you'll remember from last lecture this like KL regularization we do when we RL fine-tune our language models. If you don't, it's just basically a little incentive for it to not diverge too much from the supervised fine-tuned model. So it doesn't optimize too aggressively for the reward, and it retains most of its kind of pre-trained capabilities and like ability to generate natural sounding text. And then if you want, you can kind of repeat these steps 2 to 5. Often these are not repeated that much, if at all, which isn't great because the sort of original formulation of RLHF, if I go back, really relies on repeating this process a lot in order for it to sort of converge on good behavior. So yeah, so this is like kind of maybe already a little bit of an issue with doing this for large language models. Okay, nice. Yeah, any questions so far? Just give you guys a chance to. No, okay, excellent. All right, so how do we get this preference data then? Who are these human labelers? Well, these preferences over completions are typically generated by remote service workers on places like Upwork, Scale AI, or Amazon MTurk. So these are people who are basically paid not very much money to, when given some text completions, pick the best one. And this is kind of like bad for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of them is that, maybe they don't put as much time and effort into doing these completions than you would maybe want for something that is aligning models that are becoming more and more powerful and more ever used. This is not necessarily their fault. I think the incentive pressures are kind of in not the best state. And yeah, these remote workers are typically told to rank these completions according to how helpful, harmless, honest they are. And some preference data does come from internal employees at the labs or from user interactions that they've seen in their previous generation models. Okay, so the reward modeling data set. So we've now got a data set of prompts, and for each of these prompts, we've got 2 completions from our model, and then from our labeler, we now have a preferred completion and a dispreferred completion. So these are denoted x1 through xn, and ynw is the preferred completion, and ynl is the dispreferred completion, the winner and the loser. Okay, reward modeling objective. Time for the real heart of the lecture. Okay, so the reward model is a neural network, and it is assigning rewards to these prompt completion pairs according to its parameters phi. And yeah, more specifically, we have this like probability that YW was preferred over YL, given the prompt. So probability, that the human makes this preference choice given the prompt. And this is given by the exponentiated reward of the prompt and favored completion divided by the exponentiated reward of the prompt and favored completion plus the exponentiated reward of the prompt and dispreferred completion. So this is basically just a softmax, if you have worked with those before. And then these parameters are trained by maximizing the likelihood of preferences, or kind of more accurately, we have a loss that we're minimizing, and this loss is the average log likelihood. Okay, and yes, this is basically the Bradley-Terry model. Yeah.
This is run over every pair of preferences?
Yes, this is run over every pair. You could do this in a batch as well.
So given completion has like n things, and then the pair weights ranked, and then you do the like n squared set of pairwise comparisons.
Yeah, and typically they'll put the if you have a batch, if you have a bunch of different pairwise preferences, all from the same set of rankings, these will all be put in the same batch. Because if you don't do this, they found you get overfitting. Yeah. Any other questions on this? Yes.
The parameters are from the language model?
We'll get to that in a second. A lot of them are, yes.
Just a general question. The theta in all of the equations we keep seeing, is that representative of the entire neural network or individual?
Yeah, that just sort of captures all the parameters of the neural network. So you can think of this as like, we have some loss, it's a function of the parameters of our neural network, and we're just finding out like what is the best way to move those parameters such that we kind of maximize this.
The weights in the individual.
Yes, sorry, these parameters are the weights, so in the MLP layers or the attention layers or the embedding layers, all these things. Yeah, any other questions on this? I'm happy to stay and answer questions for this. I think this is the most important bit.
So here we're discussing pairs.
Yes.
In practice, was there ever a point at which it wasn't pairs, but instead it was a ranking of, say, 4 different prompt completions? I just remember seeing some graphic of 4 as opposed to 2 being ranked, right?
Yeah. So often when they have the rankings, even if it's over more than 2 completions, they will convert these rankings into a set of pairwise preferences. So if you have A is better than B is better than C, you kind of turn this into A is better than B is better than C, A is better than C. And so this gives you 3. There are extensions to this model you can do that will more natively handle larger rankings. This is not typically done to my knowledge. Yes.
And so this is also what's happening when Mid-Journey users are asking, say, which of these stylized pictures do you prefer?
Yeah.
But using their general stripe base rather than some people are.
Yeah, exactly. So so I think this is where some of these preferences from user interactions can come from. And they can use that to fine-tune their next model. Yeah.
There's no weighting here, right? About if you say A beats B beats C, and then you say, well, that because we have a total ordering and user rational, A B C, but I suggest that maybe A B C by a lot more because there's other things in between. But that's not in this model.
No, it's not. This is arguably a bit of a failing of this simple Bradley-Terry model, is it doesn't capture these I massively prefer A to B or I very little prefer A to B. I actually did my master's thesis investigating how the granularity of the feedback signal affects the learning dynamics. And so I basically had this idea of surely if you have more graded feedback, maybe a Likert scale or a single scalar of how much you prefer, this would allow you to learn better. And the answer is no. At least in the classical robotic settings, it turns out there's just A is better than B feedback. You have a reasonable number of them. You learn quite well, and your reward model can kind of sort of naturally generalize and figure out if it needs to push things far away or leave things a bit closer together. So yeah, I guess empirically it helps less than it maybe feels like it should. Yeah, any other questions? Good. All right, excellent. Okay, so yeah, I think an important thing to ask here is maybe why the Bradley-Terry model? Why are we doing this and not some other thing? Why this exponential? And I've seen a lot of people, even people who are trying to publish in this field, who really like to question the Bradley-Terry model and say it's terrible and it's rubbish. At least from my perspective, I think they maybe don't quite understand its advantages. So I'm gonna for a brief minute, sort of try and steel man, like, this is actually a good thing. It's not perfect, of course, but I think it does have some nice things going for it. Okay, so it makes a couple of key assumptions. The first is that, as I kind of said before, these humans act approximately rationally, and in particular, the probability they make a choice is proportional to the exponential of the reward. So this is why we have exponentials in this probability and not just like the reward scores. And more broadly, this is known as Boltzmann rationality. And this is a pretty common assumption in sociology and economics for modeling human behavior. So there's a reasonable body of literature kind of justifying that this isn't perfect, but it does kind of match humans reasonably well. The second key assumption is that choices are independent to irrelevant alternatives. It's kind of difficult to see this in the binary, like single choice model. But if you open this up to like 3 choices, so say there's like a set of 3 things and the human has to pick one, you're kind of saying the ratio of probabilities between me picking A from A, B, and C and B from A, B, and C should be the same as the ratio of probabilities of me picking A from just A and B from just A and B. Like the fact that I'm adding this like third alternative, this C thing, shouldn't affect the ratio of probabilities for the first 2. Yes.
This is very well known to be false.
Yes. so in practice with humans, this like doesn't it doesn't often hold. However, because it's just like a 2-choice thing, it's like doesn't matter as much. Yeah, particularly if you want to kind of like generalize the Raditari model, this is like an important part of it. Yeah, I think it maybe falls under sort of things that are like we know are false, but are kind of good enough and sort of give us robust answers that it's maybe worth taking the slight accuracy hit. Yeah. And another nice thing I think about it is that if you interpret the difference in rewards between 2 completions as log odds of the human preferring one to the other, then the Bradley-Terry model actually corresponds to minimizing cross-entropy loss, where your human is giving you like ground truth classification targets. And this is a very standard thing in machine learning. Now, if this bullet means nothing to you, that's okay, don't worry. But if you've like done cross-entropy loss stuff before, or you've kind of like thought about the implications of the cross-entropy loss, this is like a nice link to draw. Yeah, a kind of like key thing you can draw out of this is that it really prioritizes getting preferences the right way round versus pushing things off really far. So if I've got a data set where I say like, A is better than B and C is better than D, and so far the model is outputting a higher score for A than it is for B, but a lower score for C than it is for D, but the A and B scores are like quite close. You might argue that like, oh, well, it would model the human choice better if the scores for A and B were like even more extreme. But actually the cross-entropy loss in the Bradley-Terry model really cares about like this C and D being the wrong way around. And it really pushes the C and D to be correct more than it pushes the A and B to have like a more extreme but still correct reward difference. And yeah, and I think this is like kind of good because it means that the model is sort of like focusing on things that it's getting wrong rather than really pushing into extreme behavior. And part of this really does come from the exponential of the rewards and like taking the log. And if we weren't doing those things, it would be very easy to end up with a model that really tries to push things as far apart as possible, even if it was making mistakes elsewhere. And I think that would be like lead to poor like human evaluated performance. Okay, and then the final point is that it's actually pretty robust to intransitivity and disagreement. So yeah, another common criticism of the Raditari model I see is that human preferences don't tend to be coherent. Often people say they prefer A to B one moment, the next moment they say they prefer B to A, or different people disagree on different things. And actually the Bradley-Terry model is like kind of robust to this. As a little like mathematical exercise, if you want, if you have a data set of n times I prefer A to B and k times I prefer B to A, try and figure out what the reward the Bradley-Terry model would assign to A and B are. And you should find that it's like, it doesn't kind of like hard commit to one or the other. It does a sort of like balancing act. And to me, it like seems pretty good. Okay. Yeah, any questions on that? Excellent. Okay, so yeah, what is the reward model? I've kind of been saying it's like a neural network this whole time. There's maybe some indication that it's to do with the language model. Yeah, so first of all, we start off with a clone of the language model. So this is from the SFT fine-tuning. There it is. So you've got our tokens in, we've got our embedding layer, we've got some transformer blocks. Here I've only got 2, but there's maybe more like 20 in these frontier models. Then an unembedding layer, and we're back in token space. Okay, so the first thing I do is I replace the unembedding layer with a linear reward head. So that goes away, and we get this single reward head. So now, instead of going from the latent dimension out into a massive vector of probabilities across all possible tokens, it's just going from the latent space down to a single scalar number. And it's just a single linear matrix, no nonlinearity. And then that's basically it. We fine-tune this model on the Bradley-Terry loss. We allow every parameter still to be changed. So this reward head will be very poor to begin with. It's just been initialized. And so it would make sense to train that, but we also let the rest of the transformer get trained. So it can alter its representations and the way it's processing information if this is more helpful towards predicting accurate reward scores, now that it no longer needs to produce text. Okay, so yeah, kind of putting it all together, just to recap, we gather this reference data, which are these plot completion pairs. We train a clone of the SFT network as a reward model on this reference data using the Bradley-Terry loss function. And we then form a composite reward that combines the reward model with a KL divergence penalty. And we use the composite rewards to fine-tune the SFT policy using an RL algorithm, such as reinforce or PPO or GRPO or whatever you want. There's so many now. Yeah. Okay. Any final question on this before we move on to sort of variations, extensions-y things?
Could you explain again before?
Yes. So when we have our reward model and we've trained it to output scores that are compatible with human preferences, we want to train our language model to maximize this score, because if it maximizes this score, it means it's producing stuff which humans prefer. However, we probably don't have a huge, that much data that's been used to train our reward model versus the pre-training corpus. And so if we just let our language model very aggressively optimize this reward score, it's more likely that it's going to find defects in the reward model and sort of exploit them than it is to sort of hit upon this correct general notion we have of human preferred completions. Yeah, as a sort of concrete example for this, let's say I'm trying to get it to produce nice, good movie reviews. If I have this KL penalty, this to form this composite reward, not just individual reward, it's going to still try and produce text that is likely under its pre-training objective of just produce the next token, make natural language text. And so maybe it produces oh, this is a great film, I love the plot, the characters were all nice, full stop. If I don't use a composite reward and I just train for the reward model, maybe it just learns to spam, this is a good film, this is a good film, this is a good film, this is a good film. Because the reward model sees this and is wow, this is fantastic, this person loves this film. But we've actually diverged quite far from natural human text. This is not a hypothetical example. This happened to me when I was trying to do some of this stuff. Yeah, does that answer the question?
So then how will you use the fine-tune?
Using a reinforcement learning algorithm. Yeah, so you sample some completions from your policy, you get your reward model to score them, and then you use that score as your rewards plus a scale penalty for your RL algorithm. Yeah. Is that? Okay, nice. Yeah, any other questions? Okay, I will move on then. Yeah, so how does this do? Let's go back to this 2021 paper, the General Language Assistant as a Laboratory for Alignment. They basically showed that as you scale up the policy model and you do this RLHF procedure, it gets more honest, more helpful, more harmless. So as models get bigger, they get better at producing these things that humans tend to prefer. And they also showed on the right here, the sort of pinkish line is this preference modeling, basically RLHF, and this blue line, imitation learning, that's basically supervised fine-tuning. And they show empirically, A, that RLHF is just much more performant than supervised fine-tuning on its own, and B, that this performance gap kind of increases as the models get bigger. So it seems like if we go back to the start with our motivation for why we did all this, it seems like this was kind of good reasoning, and yet RLHF does indeed outperform supervised fine-tuning on its own, which is good. It's nice. Yeah, and then as maybe you'll remember this graph from previous lectures. So this was from the 2022 paper of training language models to follow instructions. These top two lines, the orange and the red, these are RLHF fine-tuned models using PPO. The green line is the SFT model. So again, we're like doing better than just supervised fine-tuning with our somewhat complicated RLHF setup. Yeah, any questions on those results and graphs? I know they're like a little bit, especially the previous one, a bit difficult to read maybe from the back, but yeah, the slides should be online, or you can go look up the papers. Okay, yeah, let's talk about some variations then on RLHF. So the first is direct preference optimization. Often you'll hear people talking about this or using this in practice because it's a lot simpler than normal RLHF. And so they basically made this observation that in the language modeling case, so not in general reinforcement learning, but specifically in language modeling, this like KL regularized reward, KL regularized return, has a closed form solution. And that actually you can just use this closed form solution to train your policy model on the preferred completions without needing to train a reward model. Now, this gets you some of the RLHF advantages. So it gets you some degree of rewarding or reinforcing things proportional to how good they are, but it doesn't get you a lot of them. And so its performance versus PPO and other RLHF methods is kind of still under debate a bit. But if you're wanting to just do something practical and implement something that at least uses preference data in a way one step beyond the power of supervised fine-tuning, DPO is kind of your best bet. But it's, yeah, kind of not quite as good, I think, as proper RLHF with an actual reward model. Okay, and the second paper I want to look at in this variation sections is constitutional AI, harmlessness from AI feedback. And so they give human oversight in the list, in the form of a list of rules and principles. So this is like natural language. It could be more concise and informative answers are better than like rambly, uninformative answers, or answers which are like not answers which do not have profanity and are better than answers which do. A big long list of rules and principles, probably broadly following helpful, harmless, honest criteria. And they then first supervise fine-tuning a model on self-critiques and revisions. So you give the model a prompt, you ask it to complete this prompt, and you then ask the model again, hey, this is what you said, here's the list of rules and principles, how well do you think you did? Could you now write a better response based on this? And then the model comes up with a better response, and you then fine-tune it to say, given that prompt, can you output that new, better response that you've developed after kind of reasoning through the rules and principles? And then once you've done this to your model, you generate a bunch more completions. You then ask the language model, which of these completions do you think is better? Which do you prefer? And you then train a reward model on those AI preferences and use this for reinforcement learning. And so the idea is that you're sort of leveraging chain of thought reasoning and the knowledge that the pre-training model has of human values and concepts from the massive corpus of data it's been trained on. And it actually does a reasonably bit better than normal RLHF, definitely much better harmlessness. And when I first read this paper, this really confused me. I studied information theory kind of in my undergrad, and I was thinking this seems like you're getting information out of nothing. How are you adhering more to human preferences and the human notion of good without actually having received the human feedback on what is good and bad? And so I think it's conceptually very important to distinguish the understanding the model has of what is human preferable and the degree to which it will output things which adhere to this. And so pre-training really gives it quite a rich understanding of these human concepts, and honesty, fairness. It's read every philosophy article on Wikipedia, probably a bunch of books, But this doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to act in that way. In the same way, like I can kind of understand a psychopath, but I'm not a psychopath. I'm kind of fairly aligned. Or maybe there's someone who's a sort of divine saint in how good they are, and I can sort of like understand that these people exist, but I myself, maybe a mere mortal, I'm not quite as good as them. And so, yeah, it really leverages this fact that this understanding and this exhibition of these values might be different in the model. And it's sort of adding this like sort of coherency check to them of like, hey, you should be exhibiting human values to the extent which you understand them. And this is guided by this like human-valid list of rules and principles. Okay, any questions on that? No. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so finally I want to end with some of the problems with RLHF, because there are quite a lot. So a couple of years ago, there was this big paper, Open Problems and Fundamental Limitations of Reinforcement Learning from Human Feedback, had about 20 authors on it, and they basically had this massive laundry list of concerns they had, and went into quite a lot of detail and cited a lot of relevant work on them. So I'm just going to like sort of go over each one fairly quickly, just to give you a feel. I might skip over some based on time. Yeah. So they divided these problems down into problems with human feedback, problems with the reward model, problems with the policy, and then some of these joint reward model policy training challenges. So starting with human feedback, the first kind of like broad category they identify is misaligned evaluators. So if you want your reward model to sort of represent kind of human values as a whole, it's actually really hard to select representative humans. Everyone has like their own different notion of what this means. Everyone has their own different notion of like morality and goodness, and like, how much should I balance, doing good things versus lying versus like refusing how to make a bomb. And so, selecting humans to even just like represent this diversity is quite difficult. The second is that some evaluators might have harmful biases and opinions. Some people's notion perhaps of like what is good and bad is maybe a little bit further from the median than others. Some people are just like actively, psychopaths. But there's sort of degrees to this. And yeah, and some people just like have harmful biases, which we probably don't want our reward model to pick up. And also, individual human evaluators can poison data. So there's some good literature in sort of standard machine learning of data poisoning attacks. So the idea is like, say you have some classifier, but on a few of the images, you put like a little bit of image that's like configured in a certain way, such that if the classifier like sees this little patch, it outputs a specific classification target. And it turns out you don't actually need to put that much of this sort of data in its training data in order to install this like backdoor in the model. Now it's still a bit of an open question for language model preference learning to like how easy can you poison preference data? Like, do you need like only a small number of preferences? Do you need like a lot of preferences? But the fact is, it's like potentially a problem, and yeah, the kind of like prior evidence suggests we should probably be concerned about this. Okay, next one was on difficulty of oversight. So humans make simple mistakes due to limited time. Partial observability limits human evaluators. There was a good example of this from some of the early RLHF work where they were trying to get a robot claw to like pick up a ball. Picking up a ball as a robot claw, kind of difficult. What's easier is placing the robot claw in between the ball and the camera. And then when the humans look at the camera feed, they see this claw around this ball and they're like, oh yeah, it's picking up the ball, this is good, this is better than it like, flailing around randomly. And if you're only being given like 5-10 seconds to make each preference because you want to get as many of these as possible, you're not going to notice like, hold on, it's not actually holding the thing. Yeah, it's maybe unclear how much this generalizes into like the language domain, but I think, at least to some extent. And finally, humans cannot evaluate performance on difficult tasks well. I sort of like begun this lecture by saying that as humans we can kind of recognize good behavior even if we can't always exhibit it, but there's limits to this. If I'm, I don't know, let's say I'm playing Go or chess, and it's the start of the game, and the AI makes some move, or some other person like makes some move. I don't really understand, what are the advantages of this? Like, why is this opening a good move? Maybe by the end of the game it becomes clear, or towards the end of the game I can see like, oh yes, this person won the chess game. They're great at chess, but I can't play chess. But early on in that process, it's like maybe hard for me to know whether or not what they're doing is good or bad. And yeah, I think there's like, you can generalize this too into the language domain as well. Okay, and also, yeah, humans can be kind of misled. You can make arguments for things which sort of exploit cognitive biases or maybe play into various tropes, and these like bad faith arguments can often sound like very convincing. Yeah, not going to go into too much detail on that. And finally, it's like data quality and theoretic type limitations. So data collection can introduce harmful biases. So if you're like not careful about the sort of sorts of people you're like sampling from, maybe you end up with like 90% of like one demographic versus like 10% of another. Maybe your resulting preferences are much more biased towards this demographic. And there's also this cost-quality trade-off when collecting human feedback. Ideally, you want loads and loads and loads of it. Then your reward model is like super accurate and trained on loads of different data. But human time is expensive. It's going to cost a lot of money. And so when you have these labs that are like implementing these RLHF procedures, there's this sort of like perverse incentive pressure that kind of makes it difficult for them to get lots of quality data. And even actually within the single instance of giving feedback, it's more costly for you to spend longer on it. But that often gives you a better quality preference. And then also, so feedback types have this richness versus efficiency trade-off. Kind of mentioned this before, that you can have different feedback types, so maybe you give rankings, maybe you give like natural language feedback. Not going to go into like how you leverage those concretely, but the sort of broad point here is there's a bunch of stuff you can do. Some things give you a much richer signal, but these are sort of like slower and harder to provide versus just like a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, A versus B. Okay, so the reward model, it's difficult to represent even an individual's values with a reward function. A single reward function cannot really capture a diverse society of humans. I somewhat disagree on this versus the paper, because like in my head, this is just like inherent uncertainty in the thing you're trying to model. You should be able to like build this in. But some people are like very concerned about this, and so maybe you should be too. And yeah, finally, there's like misgeneralization and evaluation difficulty. So reward models can kind of misgeneralize, even if they've been given correct data, to become poor proxies for the sort of true reward. And optimizing for imperfect proxies can lead to like what's called reward hacking. And yeah, so this makes evaluating these reward models like quite difficult. You can't really take the reward model and sort of test some of its properties to make sure that it's doing what you want. Your sort of best case is to just train your language model on the reward model and then see what the resulting language model's behavior is. So yeah, it's very difficult to kind of check that these things are doing what you want without going through the whole process. And yeah, these like first two issues of this misgeneralization and reward hacking, we're going to cover these more in lecture 9. So if you don't quite understand what this in such brief detail, don't worry, we're going to dig deeper into that later on. And then finally, with the learned policy. So yeah, in reinforcement learning, we like haven't really solved it yet. Have some pretty good algorithms, but they're not perfect, and so it's still pretty challenging, even if you've got a really good reward function, to optimize your policy to kind of maximize this effectively. And learned policies via RL tend to be adversarially exploitable. So there was a good paper where they were looking at CataGo, which is a like Go playing AI. If you know what Go is, it's like chess but better. And they showed that if you specifically trained a model just playing against this like CataGo chess genius, it was really easy for this new model to like beat the like genius one. Now humans could then beat the like adversary model because it wasn't actually that bad. It wasn't actually that good at Go, but it had just learned like very specific strategies to exploit the like genius Go player model. And so yeah, even if you end up with policies that are like very performant, they often have these like flaws and weaknesses that if an adversary really locks onto, they can exploit. And this might go quite wrong. Yeah, also policies can kind of perform poorly in deployment despite having good training performance. and optimal reinforcement learning agents tend to seek power. And yeah, these issues will also be explored in later lectures. I don't want to spend too much time on them now. And finally, your pre-trained model is going to introduce biases into policy optimization. So if it's seen lots of a particular type of data, it's going to probably produce things according to that data more and get feedback on those things more. And maybe you want a more sort of unbiased kind of broader sampling of different types of data to get feedback on in order to make sure your model is kind of aligned everywhere. So yeah, just like make this concrete. Maybe you've got a lot of, it's read a lot of recipes about how to make bombs. So it tries to make bombs a lot when you're RLHFing it, and your RLHF model can be like, no, this is bad, don't do this. But it hasn't seen that many documents about making bioweapons. And so what didn't happen in RLHF was it tried to come up with a recipe for a bioweapon, and it got hit with the hammer of like, no, this is bad. And so now your like final model, maybe it's easier to make bioweapons with it just because this was never trained out of it at RLHF time. And this has happened because the pre-training data set had varying levels of data from different types of content. Also reinforcement learning contributes to mode collapse. This is basically where models go from being able to produce a diverse range of things down to just like a very small set of things that kind of exploits the reward policy. I'm gonna not say much more on that, but if you search like neural networks, machine learning, mode collapse, you can find some really good papers on that. And then finally, this like joint reward model policy training challenges. So joint training introduces distribution shifts. So this is similar to that point on the pre-trained model introducing biases because of sampling, but this is now happening purely in the RLHF step. So if there is a completion that the reward model is underestimating how good it is, so it thinks it's kind of bad, it's going to say oh, don't produce that completion. And this means that the policy produces this completion less, but maybe this is a good completion. And so we would want a human to see this and be able to give it a thumbs up and be like, oh no, actually this is good. But because the reward model thought that it was bad to begin with, and then the policy decided to produce it less, the human never got to see it, to correct it, and to say, actually this was good. And so you have this auto-induced distribution shift. If you search that, there's a good paper on it by David Kruger. Essentially training these things at the same time is there's some quite fundamental issues with it. And finally, it's pretty difficult to balance efficiency and avoiding overfitting by the policy. You kind of want to train on a lot of different data and have your policy sort of generalize. But if you only have a small amount of data, but you still want to train it a lot, so it receives a lot of feedback signal, it's much easier for it to overfit. Which is not great. Any questions on any of these problems with RLHF just before we go into the recap? No? Excellent. Okay, so to recap then. So RLHF allows us to learn from human or AI preferences in a way that can generalize and scale, or at least generalize and scale more than SFT. A reward model is trained to replicate human preferences for helpful, harmless, and honest behavior under the Bradley-Terry model. And the large language model is trained via reinforcement learning to maximize this reward, but is penalized for diverging too far from the supervised fine-tuning model via KL regularization. And, a lot of that was kind of like last lecture, so go there if you need to recap that. And this allows us to build general-purpose text-based assistants roughly aligned with human values, because, of course, there are many problems still, and some of these are quite fundamental. There we go.